This is the Living Cities Forum, and coming up is Lynn Rees. She's a Palawa woman descending from the people of northeastern Tasmania. As an Indigenous woman, she brings a unique perspective to her role in architecture, underpinned by her personal experience, heritage, and research into the Indigenous built environment.
Nalanika, Mukanika, Warankalinika, Nuyina Nika, Warantatakara, Eastern Kulin, Miletina Nikatu, Inowana Manamapali, Nupuri Manamapali, Nuyina Manamapali, Waranta, Tunapri. This earth, this sea, this sky, these ancestors. We stand on Eastern Kulin country, and with our eyes and with our ears and with our spirits, we listen and we learn. My name is Lynn Rees. I'm a Palawa woman descending from the Plangamarina and Trawlway peoples of northeast Tasmania and convicts from and free settlers from the UK. I work at Jackson Clements Burrows Architects. I'm a lecturer at Monash University and hold a number of advisory and director roles, including co-chair of the Australian Institute of Architects First Nations Advisory Working Group and Cultural Reference Panel, and on the directorship of Pala, Women, Equity and Architecture. Everything I do is driven by a core purpose to Indigenise the built environment, so I thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to start my little yarn with a story. So back when I was learning to weave, an elder came and sat next to me one time. I'd never met her before, and I never met her again. We talked as I weaved, and once I got the hang of it, and I decided to make her something. A little while later, I handed over this very small and rather wonky looking basket. And I was a little embarrassed, to be honest, about the quality of my work. So I was very surprised when she held out her hands to receive this basket, as if it was the most precious thing she'd ever touched. She smiled, she thanked me, and then she started to tell me a story. She motioned and asked me to imagine a creek running across our feet and to understand the movement of water to represent time. She then slowly motioned, dipping this basket into the water while explaining that the weaving has small gaps in it that allows the water to flow through it, and that the woven basket represents our body. She held the basket in the running water and said, "We don't move through time, time moves through us." Back then, my very literal and pragmatic brain, highly conditioned by a very Western education that valued processes that require facts, evidence, and proof from a Western source and methodology, went into a little bit of overdrive. I couldn't stop myself from believing that there was one absolute truth that I had to find in this story, and I needed to know what this was. And I needed to know why this very generous elder shared this with me. I consciously and subconsciously came up with many interpretations, everything from time is not linear, the water representing time, which before being at my feet came from the mountains, traveling down through this creek to the body of water, to then be evaporated up into a sky and came back down to the mountain as rain, thus continuing the cycle. So maybe the point was that time wasn't linear. At times, I imagined many baskets in this river, and despite each one allowing water to flow through them, they still shifted the pathway of water that moved past or through them. So does that mean that we have to acknowledge that we have implications on the people and the things around us, and that we have to be open and generous and gentle towards those in order to not cause them harm? On the other end of that scale, maybe some of those baskets are less porous and prevented time from passing through them at all, thereby being guided by their own cyclical living, not being guided by their own cyclical living histories and causing too much damage to others by forcing water to divert around them and run into their neighbours with greater force. Eventually, I stopped pondering over this obsessively, and I sort of sat in the back of my mind for years and years. And once I stopped chasing the answers and chasing the proof and chasing the Western methodologies that I had to decolonize from myself, the answers slowly made their way to me. There is no absolute truth in this story, no one way to interpret it. And what I had imagined at the time was not wrong, but I had shut out the flow of knowledge and thinking that was happening before, because I felt the need to filter through it to find one simple truth. Over the years, I've imagined this story in many different forms, some physical, some emotional, some metaphysical. Sometimes it's about knowledge or trauma or joy. And more recently, that little creek has become a river, with each tributary holding a specific intent, experience, power, or influence, both positive and negative and everywhere in between. Each of these coming towards my basket, and unless I take the responsibility to work through those and heal them, the water keeps coming back in this cyclical nature. Ultimately, though, the more I imagine this little basket allowing the water to flow through me as time flows through me, the more I feel connected to my ancestors, their strength, resilience, and passion. I'm telling you the story because I want to talk about 3 projects really quickly that I've had the privilege of being involved in as a way of illustrating the point that I'm trying to make, is that everything that we need to do to indigenize the built environment has already been dreamed up and imagined. And our job is to listen to elders, to each other, and to be open to the experience of time that moves through us to find ways of remapping knowledges, protocols, aspirations, cultural practices, and expressions, the list goes on the worlds that we create around us. I want to start by talking about acknowledgements of country. Every time I've had the honour of being invited to attend or be a part of a welcome to country on the places that I live and work, I've always been asked a few things as part of that process: to commit to the laws and the values of that country, and to define my purpose for being here. This is not my country, and I have the honour and the privilege to live and work here, and respect that by accepting that invitation to be welcomed onto this country, I am committing to upholding the laws and values. My purpose of being here today and every day is driven by that commitment, and it's the responsibility that we all share. I've chosen architecture as my profession, and while my education did not ground me at all in this country or my responsibility to it, the elders of these countries have and continue to do so both passively and actively. They hold the right to speak on behalf of their country, and it is our job to listen and act in partnership in response. I say our, us, and we to mean all of us, because this is the commitment we all make when participating in a welcome and living on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander countries. We do 3 things in response to a welcome. The first is to deliver on what it asks of us, the commitment to abide by the laws and the values of country we live and work within, and declare our purpose. And thirdly, to move beyond that acknowledgement and into an action that recognises the power we all hold as individuals to make better decisions for country. The health and well-being of Indigenous people is intrinsically linked to the health and well-being of country, as we do not see ourselves separate from it. We are a part of it, existing in equity with it, and we are responsible to it. And if this is your country, you already know that. And if it's not your country, then this is your responsibility too. So I declare my purpose for being here today and every day as holding a responsibility to indigenize the built environment, to normalise the built environment, reflecting, embedding and celebrating country, caring for her health and well-being, working towards a built environment where the systems that exist to facilitate it align with the laws and values of the countries that they're created in. This is my long view. Every action in between is a stepping stone to a future where the built environment gives identity back to country that it took away, both cultural and sustainable. As Indigenous people know, I'm not the only one doing this. I have my ancestors who give me strength, the elders who guide me, and the community of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working collectively to create better worlds for the next generations. So my question to the audience is to ask you to assess what power you hold in the number of decisions you make every day and what changes you can make, big or small, to work in alignment with the laws and values of the countries that you live and work on. This requires a number of things of you. The first is to go back to first principles, which means many things to many people, especially in architecture, but at the core of its practice is recognising and removing the assumptions we all make, often based on the things that we've learnt as truths, but never questioned. Once we remove these, we can arrive at the most fundamental truth we can, and from this, we can arrive at a position that we can reason from. What should happen during this process, which is very much a practice, not a project, and it is lifelong. And what should happen is that we assess and reassess our individual and shared values. We all have personal values, some inherited from our families, cultures, communities, some developed based on our life experiences, both positive and negative. Our values change across the course of our lives based on our experience and serve as an internal and sometimes subconscious guide to what we consider right and wrong. Our shared values are the foundation of our rights. For example, human rights. The values and rights of human beings govern the decisions and the actions that we take and what we advocate for and protest against. I honestly can't believe I'm putting these up on a slide, but anyway, these are what the government define in Australia as Australian values. I imagine that many of you will have a quick glance at this and will notice that you would have seen at least one event, policy, action, or article in recent times that shows that these values do not hold true for Indigenous peoples and other minority groups. In understanding this, the point I actually want to make is that every single one of these is human-centric. So I may have been a bit cheeky and did a bit of a markup on behalf of country. This, of course, is not exhaustive or complete or undertaken with any engagement whatsoever. But my intent of being provocative is to shift your perspective a little bit on the responsibility we hold to the countries, places, and environments that we shape within our work. It's not all about humans, and nothing will survive if we keep operating with this mentality. To put this in context, albeit linear, the black line represents 60,000 years, plus or minus whatever science can prove, of Indigenous people caring for their countries that they've been responsible for a while, for their lifetimes. The zero in the bottom right-hand corner represents the year zero based on the calendars that we follow, and the white represents the time since colonization. I show this with the intent of contextualizing that First Nations peoples have thrived, innovated, and lived sustainably in partnership with country for a very long time. The widely told story of Australia is dominated by the hand and the perspectives of those who hold the pen, so the value of Indigenous knowledges, custodianship, and being is too often not granted the epic and frankly indescribable respect it should deserve. If nothing else from my talk, I ask you to challenge the egotistical, human-centric, patriarchal, and capitalist positions that colonization has normalized and find a place in your heart, mind, and soul to at the very least respect this reality. Now, this talk is, of course, supposed to be about architecture as well, and I promised 3 examples, and I hope to get through them quickly in the time. A handful of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous allies have been working for decades to advocate for First Nations countries and peoples in the built environment. And in more recent times, and in my generation, this community has grown to perhaps 6 handfuls of people. My experience over the last 11 years since entering the profession, the concepts of working with country and Indigenous people has gone from being not even a conversation to a nice to have to a fundamental responsibility. Over the last year, as part of my role as co-chair alongside Professor Paul Mehmet AO of the Australian Institute of Architects First Nations Advisory Working Group and Cultural Reference Panel, collectively we've had the privilege to be invited to propose changes to the National Competency Standard for Architects. This standard is a document that architecture schools are assessed by in order to gain and maintain their accreditation, what professional capabilities graduates of architecture have to prove at the point of becoming a registered architect, and what guides and informs continuing professional development for registered architects in practice. This document represents the minimum standard for architects, and through the collective effort, passion, advocacy of both the AIA, the First Nations Advisory Working Group, Cultural Reference Panel, and the AACA, for the first time this document includes an architect's responsibility to country and First Nations peoples. I don't have time to go through all of these in detail, but I do want to highlight some key aspects and encourage you to read the updated document. The introductory statement includes an acknowledgement that embedded within the practice of architecture is a recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's ongoing connection to and custodianship of country. And performance criteria include considering the implications to country in project planning, implementing culturally responsive and meaningful engagement processes that respect the importance of country and reciprocal relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and really importantly, complying with the legal and ethical obligations, including authorship of cultural knowledge and intellectual property. Having an understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's aspirations to care for country and how these inform architectural design, understanding how to embed knowledge, worldviews, perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples shared through engagement processes into the conceptual design in a meaningful, respectful and appropriate way, being able to evaluate design options in terms of cultural and community values embodied in the site, and communicate in culturally responsive ways. Be able to continue engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to produce coherent project design, resolved in terms of supporting the health and wellbeing outcomes for country, and in continuing the engagement process throughout all stages in a meaningful and respectful and appropriate way. From an Indigenous perspective, these inclusions are fundamental to the practice of architecture and in reality should be held across all built environment professions. To see these words reinforce and ground and redefine the definition of the baseline capacity of an architect to be in alignment with how Indigenous people view the practice of architecture is both incredibly affirming and a testament to everyone that came before and everyone that contributed, their ancestors and the architecture profession as a whole. This work is part of the ongoing work of the First Nations Advisory Working Group and Cultural Reference Panel and is grounded in a commitment that the Institute of Architects made in the latest update to their constitution, which was voted in with a 96% members' support. So the profession itself is changing in response to the importance that we're seeing here, but we need this action to be followed rather than just words. And this is an example of how we can, from the top down, ensure that these are embedded in our systems and find ways to commit to them and follow through on that commitment. Fundamentally, the changes to the NSCA and the AIA's commitment and constitutional change evidence 2 key points. Firstly, that the advocacy work that has been undertaken for decades by Indigenous practitioners and allies, often from the bottom up, has now been valued for the first time from the top down. And secondly, that it takes every single person, organisation or institution at every step and process along this way to hold strong the commitment to see these actions through, realise the power they hold to ensure this commitment is realised, and not give up in the face of adversity that may come. From a practice perspective, I've recently had the honour, as part of my architectural and Indigenous advisory role at Jackson Clements Bose Architects, to be invited by the Atlantic Fellows for Social Equity, or AFSE, and the University of Melbourne to work on an internal fit out for the new home at the University of Melbourne campus. I believe this project is evidence of this process of everyone along the way committing, both individuals, businesses and organisations, to procurement and design outcomes that maintain the commitment and values of the project and build in space and time in a project timeline to ensure that First Nations values, voices, opportunities and country are central to the processes and outcomes. And with permission from AFSE, I'm going to share some of the details of this project, which is currently about to wrap up documentation. The AFSE Hub at the University of Melbourne is an Indigenous-led social change fellowship program for First Nations and non-Indigenous people across Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the Pacific regions. Fellows undertake a year-long program. At the completion of their lifelong, they become members of the Lifelong Fellowship Network. The project was to relocate them into an existing building on level 5 within the new student precinct. And we started this process by having a conversation about what values guided this organisation, which were wrapped up in their program themes, including elevating Indigenous knowledges, creating fellowships, truth-telling and transforming narrative. So through these engagements with AFSE, the staff, and also with traditional owners, we mapped these program themes and the action-based values that existed within them to align with the actual project principles of what needed to be achieved in this project in order for it to be the new home for AFSE. We use this as a basis for engagement, and through engagement with traditional custodians and with AFSE and other groups that they asked us to engage with, we came up with a series of outcomes and explorations throughout the design process to explore. And one of the key things to note is that we were engaging with 3 traditional owner groups, and at the time, they advised us that there was likely to be a determination of who the registered Aboriginal party was. So the focus that we took and the outcome of this engagement was to focus on country and understand how we could embed and reflect country into this design without relying on cultural expression or language or anything that's particular to one group. So we start with the question of what do we know? We know that there was a waterway that ran to the west of the site that currently still houses eels running through the pipes underneath the ground. We know the area around our site, and we know the fundamental parts of the business that are required for AFSE to create social change. Gathering, leadership, connection, contemplation, sharing, identity, all of these contribute to how AFSE operates as a business. Then we ask, well, what can we find out? We know that this site was part of the Plains Grassy Woodland ecological vegetation class, which the difference between pre-1750 and now you can see has been almost completely eradicated. We start to map the ecology that would have existed on this site against the seasons, both from an Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspective, to understand what this place might have looked like and how we might be able to bring that identity back into this architecture, even though it's internal and on the 5th floor of a building. We looked at the timbers, we looked at the trees, and we learned that there are a number of timbers that are readily available to use in construction, but also that there are a number of materials like wattle mat rush or Lomandra filiformis that were part of cultural practices for weaving. And through engagement with AFSE, and which included groups, people representing Indigenous Australians and Māoris, it was important and became very clear that this connection between water and weaving was something that connected across nations, not just this country. And one of the key focuses for AFSE was that they wanted the project to be grounded in the place it's in, but also be able to welcome First Nations peoples coming from other countries. So we looked at the geology as well. It was 430 million year old geology, puts it into perspective, and to get a sense of what this country might have looked like, what colours it might have brought forward at different times of year, and how we might be able to imagine this site differently. So what we did is we took a cross-section through the site and mapped waterway to our west, woodland to the middle, and outcrop to the east. And it really rigorously went through not just the tangible aspects of these, but also how those tangible aspects are connected through cultural practices of water weaving and eels and any number of things. I don't have time to go through all of the research we did, but this is just a snapshot. But also, very importantly, one of the key driving factors for AFSI as an organisation is challenging the prevailing socioeconomic and political status quo that sustains inequity. And so we set out from the very beginning to establish a material selection framework or a supplier selection framework that really focused on privileging Indigenous peoples and Indigenous organisations and creations, as well as those tangible aspects of country, to bring them into this site as being the most important thing that we could work on. And I'll quickly talk through some of the design elements, but again, this is not all of them. But one of the key focuses for us was this welcome space, and this idea, as we started to research the site and listen to elders talk, that the concept of a message stick culturally is sent out to someone to invite them in, or the other way around, but always without malice, and someone is welcomed. And so while we've focused materially and culturally on the project itself being grounded in country, the cultural practices that come along with that and that invitation to come in from somewhere else has informed the design in terms of ensuring that we can facilitate cultural practices within this space too. So we've established this sort of almost chandelier of hanging message sticks that have one for every degree of the circle. So that when you lay a map down, you can draw a line out to where you've come from. And as part of your induction ceremony, that message stick gets adorned with a woven sleeve. And then over time, AFSI can map every relationship they've had and every fellowship that's come through the program by collecting all of these woven sleeves on the message sticks that they, in the areas that they come from. And so we've got a couple of images here, but also to note that we've focused on finding materials from country. We've focused on using plants from country. We've brought in the weaving plants as a key part of this as well, because we've also embedded the practice of weaving into the design, from growth to cultivation to drying to the actual process of weaving and the outcomes of weaving. We sort of asked ourselves how far could we push this, and started to look at where these plants would be housed, and started to think about the geology in particular. And we know, for example, that projects like the Metro Tunnel are currently digging through the ground in order to create their tunnels, and what the waste from that is actually the Melbourne Formation or the Dargale Formation, so the geology that sits underneath our site. And could we use that as an aggregate in concrete or as some other materials in the building to make sure that, particularly for the plants, that they're being held in some way by country rather than a foreign material. We move through to the woodland, this pit in the middle that transitions between, and we focused a lot on the trees. And a lot of Indigenous culture is not just about those tangible elements, it's also about creating the feeling of being inside that space as well. And so we did an analysis, and we figured out that we could understand and we could know the density of trees in this area and what their likely trunks were going to be, and how we could use optical illusions to create that sense of moving through a forest, even though these elements of these timber slats are going to be static. We've tried to source furniture and from Indigenous peoples, particularly this boardroom table from my dear friend Bernadette Hardy. And we've also started looking at how we can incorporate and challenge the materials that we would normally use in this environment. So we're using kangaroo leather on the banquettes, and we're using possum skins to adorn chairs, and we're bagging these existing brick walls with a material that, with a render that contains native seeds in it. So I mentioned before, as we continue through, we've included an element that allows you to cultivate those reeds and hang them up and dry them so that they can then be used by AFSI as workshop programs when fellowships first come to the site, and they're inducted into the program, and becomes part of their cultural practice and the legacy of bonding in many ways. But also, how can we celebrate the infinite knowledges that are held within, for example, eel traps or fish traps in both Australia and New Zealand, and knowing that that story exists next to the site, and that story is not just Australian, it's also global. I'll quickly jump to another project, answering the question of what does this look like in practice. And this is another work in progress, a commission from aka to myself and Nawi Caroline Briggs, who gave the welcome this morning, to design the keynote exhibition for the Gallery 1 space in an upcoming exhibition called Who's Afraid of Public Space? And so we've looked at this site, we've looked at the grid that it gave us, we've mapped against that the sort of the natural depictions of this country or the markings of this country that are born from nature, and use that as a spatial organization tool to set out something that I think is pretty special. So what we've been doing is we've been taking this idea that we've been talking about in AFSI and taking it even further. And really this idea came from Nawi Caroline Briggs talking about not being able to see herself reflected in country. And typically in architecture, you have to conform to a series of regulations that limit what you can do. And the timeframes of a project often mean that you can't innovate outside of that. Whereas in an art exhibition, we have the opportunity to take one aspect of this, being materiality and being the identity that materiality can give or bring, and explore it to an nth degree. So we've chosen over 100 sites across Victoria, representing every bioregion that exists, and mapping those and understanding what ecological vegetation class they sat in, therefore what materials could be used to represent that country, but also what's the geology, the deep time that sits underneath that site, and how by stacking these layers and actually having a deeper contextual analysis of site, can we tell a story that we don't normally tell? You know, example of this is the plains grassy woodland, but also the question of how all of these sites, while they're dispersed, are actually connected. And they're connected through the commonality of these materials. So how can we understand as we shift through country that the certain makeup of trees here will change as we move to this place? And that actually is a distinction between how we identify with that country and what that means. I've talked about a lot of things, but I guess really what I want to say, and a key point to wrap up, is to remember those words that that elder said to me, and I wish I had contact with her, was that we don't move through time, time moves through us. And in a more time-based interpretation of this strategy, or this statement, sorry, could be past is present is future. Everything we need to indigenize the built environment already exists. It has already been dreamed up, lived and mapped, and to realize, and mapped to the realities of generations before us. It is up to us to commit to the laws and values of the countries we live and work on. And it is up to us to recognize the power we hold to create change. We're not doing something new here. In fact, what we're doing is remapping the protocols, laws, values, practices, and expressions that have existed since time immemorial and making them relevant to the world we live in now. The protocols embedded in the NSCA have existed in many forms through time. The connection to country, its tangible and intangible elements, and the cultural practices that connect them are not new, nor is understanding the layers of country and how they collectively give identity and connect places with each other, and are connected to the custodianship role that traditional owners have had to care for them and still do continue to care for them. You know, my dream is that we'd be able to walk through our cities and actually be able to read the country that sits below and above us in the built environment, and understand really uniquely where we are in the world and what that means. Materials is one aspect of this, and there are so many others, but those are the 2 or 3 projects that I've had the opportunity to work on in the last 12 months. And what we're doing, what all of us are doing really, are remapping these understandings and processes and protocols into a context that we live in now. We're remapping them to our contemporary realities. And that is what we need to do. That is why time moves through us. We don't create these things when they're not new, they're old, and they're becoming relevant now to our generations and to the future of the built environment. So past is present is future. And thank you for listening.